Welcome to the Princeton Festival podcast, where we take you behind the scenes of New Jersey's premier performing arts festival. With directors, producers, artists, and supporters, we explore the creative process and the challenges of making music today. Join us on this musical adventure. Welcome to another episode in the Princeton Festival podcast. My name is Eva Kastner-Puschel. Today I'm sitting down with costume designer Marie Miller. It's exciting to have you on our show, Marie, and welcome.
Thank you. I'm excited to do this.
Marie, your long and successful career encompasses a wide variety of work. A former actress, you fell into costume design. Being a designer, you then also worked as a wardrobe mistress, stitcher, rental manager, and built costumes for actors, singers, dancers, and the famous American magician Teller. Furthermore, you dressed TV personalities, made G.I. Joe a business suit, and are known here in Princeton as the creator of the so-called 70-pede, a 60-foot-long Chinese dragon with a tiger head, for the Princeton University's annual alumni parade. Having started designing in 1961, Marie, you're still very active in building costumes and working with the festival. Can you tell our audience what is involved in costuming an opera, a play, or a musical?
Well, let's start with what a costume actually is. And basically what it is a shorthand to convey information to not only the audience, but to the actor so that he feels comfortable in what he's wearing, and hopefully it helps him to create his character. So with that in mind, obviously one does not design a costume in a vacuum. So the entire process starts with a discussion with the director, and to find out what is his take on the particular piece that we've chosen to do. For example, if we were going to do Figaro, would we do a traditional take on it? There have been many done. What can we bring to that production that makes it new and exciting and hopefully inspirational to the audience?
Yes, absolutely. And how do you then go about getting a costume?
If we're going to do a traditional version of, say, Figaro, we have to find costumes for it. And there are a variety of places where you can look. The first most obvious place is a rental house that specializes in opera, and there are several around. My favorite is A.T. Jones in Baltimore, who have been so good to the festival over the years and even created productions for us, which is wonderful because it means that we would get a new set of costumes if we needed and wanted them for something, rather than just relying on a traditional version. Rental costume houses have lots of costumes for lots of productions, so you usually can find one to choose from. And they also would have a costume in a variety of sizes, so that if your actor is a little larger or smaller, they can still accommodate it. They will also make sure that they build something for you if necessary. So you can rent your costumes, and that is really the way that the Princeton Festival usually goes with its major productions.
Okay, and now, what is involved in a costume fitting once you get the set of costumes you chose?
Well, the first thing we have to do is unpack them and then begin the laborious job of tagging every one of them so that they are labeled with what character they belong to. If we just take them out of the box and hang them up higgledy-piggledy, then we don't know who's supposed to wear what. So that labeling, unpacking and labeling takes a while. And then we make sure that we have received all of the pieces that we need. And from when that is pretty much done, we will set up our fitting schedule.
And let me ask you here, How long before the start of rehearsals do you usually get the actors' measurements? And also, do you have to meet with each member of the cast individually?
I do have to meet with each member of the cast individually. The only time I wouldn't would be if we have double cast someone. I would meet with the two people who were playing that specific role together and do their fittings together. But it would still take the same amount of time. We would just schedule twice the amount of time that we would normally schedule. We normally start getting measurements as soon as the performer is cast. And in the case of principals, we ask them when their contract is signed to send us a copy of their measurements. For the chorus, we normally go to each audition where chorus members are being auditioned, and our artistic director, Richard, has set up a nice system that we worked out many years ago where we are on site, and so we end up with, hopefully, everybody's measurements.
That's great. Now, when coming to a fitting, what advice do you have for singers and actors, especially the inexperienced ones, in terms of what they should wear or shouldn't wear, bring with them, etc.?
Well, it depends on the opera. In some cases, and I don't do this very often, but if it's a modern dress opera, I will ask them to bring a set of items for which I've given them information previously that they might consider wearing. But for the most part, I ask them to bring shoes. For example, for women, it's normally character shoes. And for the gentlemen, it's normally an Oxford or a slip-on shoe.
Sometimes the actors have to make a so-called quick change. Can you explain to our listeners what that is and how you accomplish it?
Well, a quick change is when an actor has to change his clothes very, very fast and get back on stage. There are a variety of them. There are some that are extremely quick. There are some you just have to step on it. And there are others that they can do in their dressing rooms.
I remember the Princeton Festival production, The Marriage of Figaro, in 2015, and you also mentioned it earlier. And by the way, this is going to be part of this season's opera streaming this coming Sunday, June 14th. Marie, you and your team worked on historical costumes for that, and I recall that Susanna, the maid, had to do a quick change getting into her wedding gown for the wedding scene.
Uh-huh.
Do you remember what challenges came with that?
No. However, I would imagine that what we did was we made sure that the wedding gown had a foolproof opening, which would be Velcro or hooks and eyes rather than a zipper, that could be undone very, very quickly. If the gown was laced up the back, I have a special quick release rod that I stick in the lacings that I pull and the whole thing drops off. But what I remember particularly is a funny thing happened on the way to the forum. We had multiple quick changes in that, some down to several seconds, literally 8 seconds, 9 seconds, 10 seconds for somebody to walk off stage and become somebody else. So that figures in the planning of the costumes from the very beginning. And the audience very much appreciates it when they figure out what has to be happening. You know, how did they do that? Sometimes things turn inside out. Sometimes you put a cape over somebody or something. Sometimes it's a quick release and they are what is called underdressed, which means that the costume that they're wearing next has been put at some previous time during the show underneath whatever they're wearing right now. So it's a matter of just stripping off what they are wearing. And then during the fitting, we will rehearse that quick change because I have found that the directors, sad to say, not our Stephen, are not willing to stop for costume problems during a dress rehearsal. So I take time with the actors to work with their quick change and practice it with the people who are going to be doing it because it's choreographed. And it's not fair to have a singer worrying about whether he's going to be making his quick change in time or not.
Yes, so they are really an integral part of the production.
They are.
Mm-hmm.
And I did a French farce years ago in which the centerpiece of that was that the upper-class aristocratic gentleman looked exactly like the custodian of the hotel. And so it is constructed in such a way that the first change from one to the other has plenty of time to do it. And from then on, every time he changes, and he changes many times during the show, the time in which he has to do it is half. By the final time he walks off stage and walks back on again as the other character, the audience caught on, and there was applause usually when he came back for that last change.
That's fantastic.
So audiences enjoy things like that, but they can't be allowed to get in the way of the main thrust of the piece that you're doing.
Mm-hmm. Now, I know you hire a team to work on costuming a production. Can you explain to our listeners what is the difference between a stitcher, a dresser, and a wardrobe manager?
Well, a stitcher, as the term implies, works on the sewing machine or by hand. And they are the workers, and they need to be talented. So they could go from cloth, which has been cut and is created into a costume, down to alterations. Now, alterations for a costume can be very simple or incredibly elaborate. I mean, for Nixon in China, we needed to pull an entire suit apart and put it back together again. That's what a stitcher does. A dresser is the person who is basically the costume ambassador. Although they probably help with some of the wardrobe chores, their main function is to help the actors and singers in changing their clothes, but their main function is to work the quick changes. The wardrobe manager is the person who is basically the overseer, the person who looks ahead, as it were, the person who decides that we need to have a double set of T-shirts for our men singers, for example, because we're going to do 2 performances in one day, and there isn't enough time to get that entire load of laundry through the machines in time for the second performance. And at the end of the show, the wardrobe manager is generally in charge of collecting all the costumes, packing them up, and getting them sent back to where they came from.
Now, let's get back to Nixon in China, which you just mentioned. That was the Princeton Festival's opera last season, 2019. And you rented costumes for that very production, and it was very difficult to secure those. Can you share with us the process?
Oh my. Well, the process began, and I brought out my notes on that, began on the 28th of August the preceding year, where I kind of went online and tried to find out who had done Nixon in China and when and where. And I have 5 pages of notes. It was kind of like chasing the Holy Grail. Luckily, I actually found them eventually in time for our production. But there were contradictions online about who had done what, when, and where. The first thing I did was I eliminated the European productions. Just the administration of something like that would have been incredibly difficult, so anything foreign went off my table. And I compiled a list of organizations who had done it. And on that list are Houston Grand Opera, the Met Debut, Toronto, Opera Theater St. Louis, Indiana University, let's see, who else? San Diego, Opera Colorado. Okay, so now I have a list, and I keep trying to follow them back, and that led to inconsistencies and dead ends. And in March, I got really going on it. But most of the Met, obviously, I scratched off my list because, first of all, I found out they copied the originals, which were done by Houston Grand Opera. And the Met doesn't rent their costumes, and even if they did, I wouldn't have been able to afford them. So Virginia Opera was very helpful, and she sent me to San Diego, and San Diego finally got me back on track. I finally figured out that Houston, although they had designed it originally and built it in 1987, that those costumes had been used and used and used and were probably, if they still existed, which I found out later they did not, were too worn out to actually use. And so I finally found out that Houston Grand Opera, and this was the source of some of the confusion, did it again as their 30th year anniversary of having debuted it. The other thing that got in the way of finding out what had happened was a hurricane. I don't remember the name of it, but it devastated Houston and Galveston, and Houston Grand Opera stores some of its costumes at its facility in their basement, and they lost everything. They did not lose what was in their warehouse, luckily, so they weren't completely devastated. So then when I finally found that they had done it again in 2017, I was terrified to find out that it had been in their basement. Well, it turns out it hadn't. That was the good news. The bad news was that they didn't own it anymore. They had sold it to Michigan Opera. So I chased down Michigan Opera, and there was good news. Yes, we could rent it. But the bad news was that although they had bought it, intending to use it at some time in the future, I don't believe they've used it yet, they had not unpacked it. So luckily I'd started early enough that they were able to unpack and inventory it in time to get it to us for our production. But it was a merry chase.
Wow, what a story.
I'd always wanted to be a detective, I think, in a former life, and so it was kind of fun to chase it down.
Oh, that's perfect. Yeah. Now, let's talk about the budget.
Oh, my, yes. There was the budget. And after I had founded at Michigan, we were pretty much committed. I had explored every opportunity, and there just weren't any others. It was not available at costume rental houses because it's not done often enough for them to have a set of those costumes.
So, if you can't rent it from a costume rental house, but from a theater instead, as it was the case with Nixon in China, how does that impact the budget?
If you rent from another theater company or another opera company, the price goes up to almost 3 to 4 times as much as it would to rent them from a costume rental house.
So, you have a reputation for getting the most out of limited resources. Can you share how you accomplish that, and does it mean a compromise of the artistic product?
If it's going to compromise the artistic product, then it's time for a discussion with the director, in which I would explain to them what I can do for the money I have. Then we would discuss, well, how can we get at your intent without spending quite so much money? In fact, I find that sometimes when you have to pinch your pennies, you come up with a solution which is better than it would have been if you not had budget constraints. I think it's written on my DNA that I'm a miser. It doesn't matter whose money it is. I can't spend it unless I get value received.
I like that very much. That's great. You have worked with the Princeton Festival since its inception. What brings you back to the festival year after year?
The people, and the fact that the festival is organized in a way that is slightly different from other companies. Of course, every company finds its own family dynamic, if you will, but the festival allows me to basically run the whole department myself. They check in with me and make sure I have everything I need, and more importantly, that I'm on time and on budget. But basically, I'm left to do the job as I choose. That's what makes me come back.
Mm-hmm. And we're so glad to have you back each season. Now, you are also an actress, or you were an actress, and you hold a university degree in chemistry. If you could choose your career all over again, would it be in costuming?
I would love to do forensics, I think, detective work and forensics, using my chemistry background. And I've always loved doing puzzles. And so I think I would have liked to have done that.
And costuming?
I've certainly enjoyed it. It's not that I wouldn't have done it if I didn't enjoy it. So
yes. And what advice do you have for young people, or as a matter of fact, for anyone who wants to become a costume designer?
Well, it's all about your education. And there are wonderful schools. Rutgers has one of them. to train costume designers, and they train them in all the aspects of it, which is pattern making. They also train them in design and, everything that they need to do. And there have been some good designers who have come out of that Rutgers program. But now, if you want to really advance your career, you probably will need to, at some point, join the union, because theater and everything else these days is so expensive that a production company cannot afford to take a chance on somebody who looks good on paper but doesn't have that union stamp. So my advice to anybody who really wants to do this job, have something else to fall back on when times are tough.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great piece of advice. To wind up our lovely conversation, I have a few rapid fire questions prepared. Haydn or Scarlatti?
For the long term, probably Scarlatti. Oh, Haydn is wonderful, but eventually it's too calm.
Violin or viola?
Viola.
Record player or smartphone?
Record player.
Bebop or cool jazz?
Cool jazz.
Milk chocolate or dark chocolate?
Dark.
Mountain or beach?
Beach.
All right.
I have one last thing to say to the audience, and that is, if you're at a theatrical production or an opera and you're bored, you can amuse yourself by imagining what underpinnings are the singers or actors wearing that make the costume look the way it does. For example, all those huge wide hips on 18th century women. Imagine the cage that goes underneath all of that. How did that actress get that cleavage? That has to do with the corset and the various inserts in it. If you ever find yourself in a situation where you have tuned out of the performance, concentrate on the underwear.
Thank you. I love that.
Well, I hope so.
Marie, thank you for providing such a revealing insight into the world of costuming. While we unfortunately cannot show any of your creations here in this podcast, listeners will have a chance to see your costumes when tuning into our Sunday opera streams during this month. So I hope that our listeners will pay special attention to the costumes. And of course, we cannot wait to see your beautiful creations in future festival years. To our dear listeners, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Be sure to visit our website at www.princetonfestival.org to learn more about upcoming events, especially our digital season Virtually Yours this month, as well as ways on how to support the festival. Please join us again next time for another exciting episode in our series. Thank you for listening and goodbye.